We are taught to treat family heirlooms with absolute reverence, believing they guard the threshold of our safety. But what happens when outsiders slip past that guard, turning your own sanctuary into a staging ground for a silent psychological war? I thought I was just protecting our lineage. I didn't know that a hidden directive had already been cast upon my soul, leaving me completely open to an execution that almost cost me my sanity. It started in the suffocating heat of early June 2018. My name is Asher, and I live a split existence. By day, I work a corporate service job, but behind closed doors, I carry the weight of a heavy ancestral lineage, a sensory calling passed down from my grandfather. I've always possessed a distinct sensitivity to the static of the unseen world, a practical awareness of the local energies that drift through old metropolitan rooms. I share a residence with my two older brothers, while our parents live in a separate house across town. Our home had always been balanced, anchored by an ancient wooden altar holding historical family artifacts passed down through generations. The peace shattered when my eldest brother's wife brought her family down from the northern states for an extended week-long visit. Among the guests was her aunt, a woman introduced with a heavy air of importance as a senior spiritual practitioner of a traditional regional order. From the moment she stepped over the threshold, the air turned dense, carrying a sharp, critical friction. On the fourth day of their visit, the aunt set up a deck of cards in our dining area, offering to read the fortunes of anyone willing to listen. I had an urgent work obligation and had to leave the house immediately, completely unaware of the mistake unfolding in my absence. My mother, fascinated by local superstitions, did the one thing a traditional lineage explicitly forbids. She provided the aunt with the exact hour, date, and year of my birth. When I returned home later that evening, the guests were gone, but my mother was waiting for me with a wide, unsettling smile. "She read your charts, Asher," my mother whispered, her eyes shining with simple excitement. "She said your alignment is incredibly strong. A perfect vessel for prosperity." A freezing knot tied itself tightly in my stomach. To a practiced eye, giving away a specific birth matrix to a rival practitioner is equivalent to handing over the keys to your front door. Within 48 hours, the true objective of their visit came to light. My sister-in-law began aggressively demanding that we dismantle our historical family altar and replace it entirely with the icons of her aunt's specific northern order. My father resisted fiercely at first, pointing out that our current relics had defined our household for decades. But the domestic pressure was relentless. To maintain family harmony, a toxic compromise was struck. The foundational ancestral items would remain, but the auxiliary guardians would be removed, thrown into the river, and replaced with brand new figures chosen by the aunt. Because my personal spiritual calling was deeply tied to the old arrangement, my father and I had to physically separate my practice, relocating my primary tools to a small, isolated table in the corner of my upstairs bedroom. The aunt openly mocked the transition, loudly whispering to my parents that my private practices were dark, volatile, and actively blocking my brother's commercial success. We ignored the malice, and they eventually brought in an elderly ceremonial officiant to seal the new altar arrangement. I stood quietly at the back of the room during the ritual. The elderly officiant walked past my isolated bedroom doorway, stared intensely at my personal collection for a long, silent moment, and walked away without uttering a single word. I thought the worst was over once the ceremony concluded. I was entirely wrong. That very night, as I sat on my bed reading a text, an explosive, localized pressure slammed into my skull. My vision spun violently. and a severe wave of cognitive exhaustion hit me so hard my forehead nearly struck the floor. It felt exactly as if I had consumed an impossible amount of alcohol within a single second. As I struggled to orient my breathing, my bedroom faded into a dim, monochrome haze. Through the fog, a terrifyingly lucid projection forced itself into my mind. I was looking directly into my upstairs room. Right at my small altar, a woman was standing over it. It was the aunt. Her fingers were stretched out, desperately trying to plant an unmapped, negative item directly into the center of my space. But before her hand could settle, a sudden, blinding physical force erupted from the wood, violently striking her chest. The projection showed her throwing her head back, collapsing violently onto the floorboards. My eyes snapped open, and the modern reality of my bedroom rushed back. My chest was heaving. I immediately utilized an oral call to summon my local guardians to audit the room. The confirmation was instantaneous. While the household was asleep, the aunt had covertly slipped upstairs to place a binding hex on my specific station, only to be violently repelled by the residual defense left by my grandfather. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood boil, but for the sake of my brother's domestic peace, I chose to stay completely silent. When they packed their bags to leave 2 days later, the aunt smiled warmly, gripping my hands with a sickening display of affection. I just nodded, hiding the cold sweat on my palms, silently watching her facade drop as she turned toward the car. 2 months passed before the second phase of the directive active dropped. In mid-August, the aunt returned under the pretext of checking on the new altar setup. I was sitting on the sofa at my parents' house around 11 a.m., laughing through a routine conversation with my mother, when my motor functions completely ceased. A profound, icy fatigue drained the strength from my limbs. My skin turned gray, and a torrential cold sweat soaked through my shirt as I collapsed sideways onto the cushions, entirely unable to lift my head. My mother panicked, screaming my name, but I could barely produce a raspy whisper. Deep within my consciousness, my station guardians managed to pierce through the lethargy, warning me that a severe atmospheric deployment was currently being executed at my own house. Utilizing every ounce of residual willpower, I reached for my phone and called my youngest apprentice, commanding him to drive to my parents' house and transport me back immediately. By the time we pulled into my driveway, the aunt's vehicle had already departed. My apprentice practically carried my limp body up the stairs to my room. The air inside the house felt stagnant, smelling faintly of old sulfur and burnt fat. I dragged myself to my feet, lit a thick cluster of protective herbs, and instructed my apprentice to stand guard at the threshold to block any external psychic interference. I executed a severe grounding chant, wrapping a protective barrier around my consciousness while focusing entirely on reclaiming the room. My apprentice later told me that the moment I closed my eyes, the natural sunlight outside the window seemed to vanish, plunging the room into a deep, pitch-black shadow where only the small space around my feet retained a faint, golden glow. When the chant concluded, the dense pressure exploded outward, completely clearing the air. To prevent further intrusion, I spent the next afternoon crafting a heavy silk ward, embroidering a specialized localized grid onto the fabric and draping it directly over my station to act as a permanent kinetic shield. That night, a deep dream pulled me back into the fog. My grandfather appeared, standing beside a rushing stream. He handed me a brilliant yellow metallic plate inscribed with a complex authority sigil. "This is your license of execution," his voice boomed, echoing through the dream state. "Replicate its design. Take it to the original sanctuary where your calling was first sealed, and let it absorb the natural current of the earth. It will bind directly to your life force, accelerating your recovery after every defensive deployment. Do not forget. I awoke with total clarity. Working alongside my apprentice, I manufactured the plate according to the dream's exact specifications and took a long journey into the mountain district, leaving the object inside an ancient, hidden stone chapel for 48 hours to charge. When we returned, I sealed the item inside a reinforced wooden box at the foot of my station. As I applied the final binding wax to the lock, a deep, raspy male voice cut through the silence of the room, speaking directly into my right ear. Remove the yellow linen flag from your cabinet. I froze, instinctively replying out loud to the empty room. Why? The lock is already secured. The voice shifted instantly into a thunderous, authoritative roar that rattled the windows. Bring the flag out now. Realizing a higher authority was commanding the room, I immediately opened the cabinet, pulled out the yellow elemental flag, and laid it perfectly flat across the wooden box. The moment the fabric settled, a surge of intense, vibrating heat rushed up my arms, completely filling my chest with an ironclad vitality. The chronic fatigue that had plagued my muscles for months vanished in an instant. I knew then that the silent war had reached an end, and I had successfully held the line. My sibling's wife still looks at me with a cold, buried hatred whenever we cross paths at family dinners, a silent acknowledgement that her aunt's subtle play for control had utterly failed. Life in our house has settled back into a standard, quiet routine. My brothers and I continue to share the space, and the yellow flag remains undisturbed over the locked box beneath my station. My health is completely restored, and my mind belongs entirely to me. But every now and then, when the clock strikes 11 a.m. and the morning sun hits the living room sofa, my hands begin to feel faintly numb. I find myself staring at the main family altar downstairs, looking at the smooth, unfamiliar faces of the new icons my sister-in-law forced into our home. They look perfectly serene under the soft lighting, but as the shadows shift, a freezing thought lingers in the back of my brain. I successfully insulated my own bedroom, but I can't shake the terrifying realization of what unseen currents might still be quietly feeding through the altered foundation of the house where we sleep. We are told that true love can cross any boundary, even the veil of death itself. But they never warn you about the cost of pulling a soul out of the abyss. I thought I was just clearing the dark, suffocating regrets of the man I lost. I didn't know that to break an ancient, blood-bound curse, I would have to trade away chunks of my own life force, drop by drop, until my own skin turned to ash. My split existence has always been a heavy burden to carry. By day, I work a standard, soul-crushing corporate service job, but behind closed doors, I carry the weight of an ancestral lineage passed down from my grandfather, a distinct, sharp sensitivity to the heavy static of the unseen world. But back in 2012, none of that mattered because I had Ethan. We were together for 4 deeply happy years, navigating a quiet, dedicated relationship. But in early 2016, the reality of our lives fractured. Ethan told me we had to break up. His family in a remote, heavily forested timber town in rural Oregon was struggling, and he needed to return home permanently to support them. Though my heart was utterly shattered, I respected his devotion. Before he left, I spent my savings to take him on a week-long getaway to Vancouver, wanting to build a reservoir of beautiful memories before the separation. Once he moved, we cut contact, and I threw myself blindly into my corporate work to numb the agonizing quiet of my apartment. 6 months dragged by. One evening in mid-2016, while out at a lively downtown lounge with friends, an abrupt, violent wave of somatic panic slammed into my chest. My heart raced, and a suffocating layer of unexplained dread settled over me. Unable to shake the feeling, I abandoned my friends and hurried back to my apartment. As I stepped onto the dark staircase leading up to my bedroom spiritual station, I froze. The air turned freezing cold, and I distinctly felt the dense, heavy presence of a wandering spirit hiding directly beneath the wooden frame of my altar. But before I could focus my senses, the energy vanished into thin air. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, chased by a lingering paranoia. At exactly 5 a.m., my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. It was from a mutual friend from Ethan's hometown. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the screen, and my breath completely left my lungs. It was a stark, high-contrast photograph of a funeral home. Sitting right in the center of the floral arrangement was a framed portrait of Ethan. Driven by pure panic, I immediately called the mutual friend. He answered, his voice thick with hysterical sobbing, his heavy regional accent making his words completely garbled through the static. Realizing I couldn't understand him, I hung up and aggressively fired off text messages, demanding the exact coordinates of the family estate. Within an hour, I packed a small bag, requested 3 days of emergency leave, and hired a trusted local driver friend to transport me into the deep country. The drive was agonizing. We spent hours navigating narrow, unpaved logging roads, flanked by towering, suffocating pine trees, passing the gray concrete walls of an old state penitentiary before the sky turned a dark, bruised purple. At 7 p.m., we finally pulled into a desolate, fog-covered rural town square. The mutual friend was waiting for us on an old motorcycle. I left my driver friend at a local motel and hopped on the back of the bike. As we sped through the pitch-black woods toward the house, the wind howling in my ears, I leaned forward and shouted over the engine, asking what had happened to Ethan. The mutual friend didn't turn around. He just stared straight ahead into the fog and uttered 5 devastating words. He drank agricultural weed killer. My jaw dropped in pure horror. Ethan was the most vibrant, cheerful person I had ever known. Why? I choked out. The mutual friend's shoulders slumped. He was brutally betrayed by someone from the city. When we arrived at the family estate, the atmosphere was thick with a specialized, suffocating grief that only accompanies a suicide. I walked into the living room, my legs feeling like lead. Ethan's casket sat in the center of the room, surrounded by weeping relatives. The family had absolutely no idea about our past relationship. To them, I was just a polite corporate friend who had traveled from the city to pay my respects. I stood by the wooden casket, locking my jaw so tightly to keep from screaming that my teeth ached. But as I leaned over the polished wood, the emotional dam broke. A single heavy tear slipped down my face and landed directly onto the casket. In traditional folklore, letting a living tear fall onto a fresh casket is a severe taboo. It binds the dead to the grief of the living. The instant the drop hit the wood, a violent ice-cold draft of negative energy exploded through the open window, rattling the funeral wreaths. I instinctively looked toward the glass. Standing right outside the frame was the unmistakable, translucent spirit of Ethan, but he wasn't looking at me with love. His phantom face was twisted, and I heard a hollow, metallic echo of his voice laughing, a bitter, mocking, deeply resentful sound that made my skin crawl. A second later, the entity drifted away, fading through the drywall toward the back room where his grieving parents sat. After the agonizing burial the following morning, where his mother wailed hysterically into the open earth, the family allowed me to sit quietly in Ethan's old bedroom to rest before my long drive back. The room felt freezing. Suddenly, Ethan's old golden retriever lunged into the doorway, kneeing its teeth and growling at me with a terrifying, unprovoked hostility, as if I were a mortal enemy. Simultaneously, a thick, gelatinous sheet of pure malice dropped right behind my shoulder blades. I spun around. The room was empty, but the air smelled heavily of copper and burnt grass. Ethan was standing right behind me in the unseen text of the room, completely wrapped in a heavy, volatile layer of unresolved resentment. Before I left, I sat with his mother, cautiously asking about his final months. Through a veil of tears, she revealed that after our breakup, Ethan had met a wealthy man from the city named Lucas. Lucas had systematically seduced him, isolated him from his friends, and completely drained Ethan's modest life savings under the guise of a fraudulent business investment. Destitute, humiliated, and utterly broken, Ethan returned to Oregon, spiraling into a catatonic depression. In a moment of pure, desperate madness, he walked into the barn and swallowed a massive dose of paraquat, a highly toxic, banned herbicide. His mother wept as she described the horrific reality of his final days. The chemical didn't kill him instantly. It spent days slowly melting his internal organs from the inside out. He spent a week rolling on the hardwood floor in severe physical agony, suffocating as his lungs progressively turned to fibrous stone, screaming for his mother to save him as the terrifying realization of death set in. He died in his parents' arms, his eyes fixed on a religious icon on the wall, his last breaths filled with a burning, unadulterated malice toward Lucas. I returned to the city completely consumed by a dangerous, obsessive grief. I established a secret memorial plaque for him at a quiet downtown Eastern sanctuary he used to love, and I wore strict black mourning clothes for a full year. I even traveled back to Oregon to offer his father thousands of dollars to buy the empty burial plot directly adjacent to Ethan's grave, desiring that we rest together. But his father coldly refused, stating that the local ground belonged only to people born in the Timber Valley. 5 months after his passing, the haunting escalated. Ethan appeared in a terrifyingly lucid dream, his face gray and decayed, whispering into my ear, "I'm coming back to stay with you. I'm never leaving." For the next 3 weeks, reality blurred. Every night, a dark, blurry human shadow would materialize at the foot of my bed, pacing rhythmically across the floorboards, draining the ambient warmth from my room. I knew from my grandfather's texts that a soul who dies in severe physical agony while harboring immense hatred is fundamentally doomed to become a wandering, predatory entity. Desperate to save him from eternal torment, I consulted several urban spiritual readers, but the moment they scanned my aura, they shuddered and turned me away, terrified of the volatile density of the resentment clinging to my skin. Finally, I connected with a spiritual senior brother practicing in a neighboring district. He analyzed the situation and agreed to perform a severe severing ritual, but warned me coldly, "I can only clear 50% of this density. The rest is anchored to his soul. To dissolve a suicide curse of this magnitude, you need a severe localized extraction." That night, I quailed before my bedroom station, begging my ancestral line for a directive. As I stepped away from the altar, a profound, explosive dizziness hit my skull. The world spun, and a cryptic, booming, frenetic chant repeated 3 times directly into my eardrums with an echoing, thunderous resonance. Om Amoga Vairocana Mahamudra Manipadma Jivala Pravartaya Hum. When my mind cleared, my instinct instantly identified the rite. It was the ancient esoteric mantra of light, tied directly to a highly dangerous, forgotten ritual known as the sand scattering method. The directive required a practitioner to gather clean white sand, purify it through water, mix it with raw, expensive cinnabar powder, and infuse it with the mantra to completely dissolve the karmic chains of a corrupted grave. But my lineage's specific version carried a horrific catch. It acted as a severe kinetic siphon. The sand wouldn't draw energy from the ether. It would actively consume the physical life force of the practitioner to fuel the purification. I didn't care about the risk. For 21 consecutive days, from exactly 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., I locked myself in my room. I held a small ceramic jar of white sand and cinnabar in my left hand, forming a binding guard mudra, while my right hand held a blessing mudra toward the ceiling. I recited the mantra exactly 108 times each night. The physical toll was catastrophic. By the second week, my coworkers asked if I was undergoing chemotherapy. My skin turned an ash gray, deep purple bruises formed under my hollowed-out eyes, and my muscles withered until I looked like a walking skeleton. My grandfather's meditative training was the only thing keeping my heart from failing. On the 19th night, disaster struck. My father entered my room to drop off laundry, accidentally knocked the ceramic jar off my shelf, and swept the crimson-tinted sand directly into the outdoor trash, believing it was toxic construction waste. We like to imagine that the small frictions of daily life, a forgotten debt, a broken promise, a petty argument between neighbors, stay confined to the daylight hours where they belong. But in isolated communities where the fog rolls off the water and the silence hangs heavy, petty malice can grow into something monstrous. I watched a trivial dispute open a door to a relentless, localized haunting, leaving a blood-stained foundation that refuses to let the living rest. It started in the late autumn of 2014 along the isolated iron-gray coastline of eastern Maine. My name is Ian, and for most of my life, I've lived in a small, weathered aquaculture settlement where the local economy revolves entirely around deep-water commercial shrimp processing and commercial holding pools. It's the kind of town where everyone knows the rhythmic hum of the aeration compressors running through the night, and where neighbors live in tight, self-contained loops. Two families dominated our specific stretch of the Marsh Road. Julian, a quiet, industrious man who lived with his pregnant wife and their young son, and Nolan, an aggressive, short-tempered operator who shared an older property down the road with his two younger brothers. For nearly a year, an unsettling undercurrent of hostility had been building between them. Nolan owed Julian a debt of roughly $3,000, a small sum in the grand scheme of commercial fishing, but a massive strain on a working household. Months passed, and despite constantly pleading poverty, Nolan suddenly broke ground on a massive, expensive concrete extension to his house, building a high, polished granite bench right along the front porch facing the road. Whenever Julian asked for his money, Nolan would make excuses, his face turning dark and defensive. Desperate to cool the rising tension, Julian finally accepted a toxic compromise. Nolan handed over a massive industrial-grade oxygen compressor tank from his barn to Kuntru to offset the debt. It was a heavy, specialized piece of machinery used to keep the deep holding pools aerated during harvest season. The arrangement held until a freezing Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. Nolan had abruptly sold off one of his secondary shrimp pools to an outside commercial buyer and needed the industrial compressor tank back immediately to clear out his remaining inventory before the transport trucks arrived. He drove his flatbed truck down to Julian's property during the midday lull. Julian was out on the deep water docks miles away, completely unreachable. Only Julian's wife, who was currently 5 months pregnant and nursing a severe winter cold, was home. When Nolan demanded access to the equipment shed, the wife refused. She didn't understand the complex valves of the commercial machinery. She didn't have the keys to the heavy flatbed, and she politely but firmly told him through the screen door that he would have to wait until Julian returned from the docks later that evening. In a normal community, that would have been the end of it. But Nolan was a deeply paranoid, volatile man. He completely misinterpreted her caution as an act of deliberate disrespect, believing the family was trying to permanently steal his compressor. He drove back to his property in a state of blinding, quiet fury. According to the police reports that later circulated through the county, Nolan sat in his kitchen for 10 minutes, pulled a heavy serrated hunting knife from his gear bag, concealed it deep within the lining of his oilskin coat, and walked back down the marsh road. He tricked Julian's wife into letting him into the enclosed mudroom under the pretext of checking the shed's serial numbers. The moment the heavy outer door clicked shut, completely obscuring them from the lonely coastal road, Nolan lost his mind. He drew the hunting knife and stabbed Julian's wife 24 times. It wasn't a quick, defensive attack. The medical examiner later noted that the killer had deliberately twisted and rotated the blade after each impact, systematically destroying her internal organs while her unborn child suffocated in the dark. Once the screaming stopped and the kitchen floor was entirely submerged in a thick, wide pool of crimson, Nolan calmly walked out, closing the front door behind him. As he walked down the driveway, an elderly neighbor who suffered from a severe cognitive developmental delay spotted him. She was standing by her mailbox, her childlike mind completely unaware of the slaughter that had just occurred. "Nolan," she called out innocently, "why were you inside Julian's house?" Nolan didn't stop walking. He kept his hands buried deep inside his bloody pockets and muttered a chilling throwaway line. Her power line snapped. She's dead on the floor. Then he disappeared into the fog. The slow-witted neighbor stood there, utterly confused, repeating his words to herself over and over again. Nolan didn't flee the county. He went back to his house, washed his clothes, threw the serrated knife into the deep, murky waters of his aquaculture pool, and walked straight into the local sheriff's department to surrender before anyone had even discovered the body. Meanwhile, a local mail carrier arrived at Julian's house to drop off a parcel. The elderly neighbor walked over and happily repeated Nolan's statement. The girl inside is dead on the floor. Paralyzed with fear, the mail carrier pushed the front door open and instantly screamed, flagging down a passing seafood transport truck. The scene inside was completely graphic, a terrifying testament to pure human malice. By the time the state police locked down the perimeter, Julian was brought back from the docks. The grief completely shattered him. The state police required him to enter the county morgue to formally identify his wife. While there, the medical examiner gently pulled back a sterile sheet to show him his unborn child, a perfectly formed tiny baby girl, completely stained red, no larger than a small creature, pulled from the wreckage of her mother's body. The sight caused Julian's family to collapse into violent, hysterical seizures of weeping. The funeral took place 3 days later, and that was when the supernatural reality of the tragedy began to bleed into the physical world. Consumed by an explosive, unyielding rage, Julian's older brother stood before the congregation during the wake and demanded a severe act of protest. He commanded the pallbearers to lift the heavy steel casket and wheel it down the marsh road, intending to place it directly on Nolan's front porch to force Nolan's remaining brothers to look at the consequences of their family's bloodline. 8 grown, heavily built dock workers stepped up to lift the casket from the metal gurney, but the moment they applied force, they froze. The casket didn't move a single centimeter. They adjusted their grip, straining until their muscles bulged and their boots slipped on the hardwood floor. But the box felt as though it had been welded directly into the center of the earth. It was physically impossible to lift. Realizing the atmospheric weight in the room, the older brother stepped directly to the head of the casket, laid his palms on the steel, and whispered a solemn vow into the wood. "I will hunt for absolute justice for you and the baby. I will not let him escape." The instant the words left his lips, the immense weight vanished. The 8 pallbearers lifted the casket with ease, carrying it out into the freezing coastal rain. But as the procession dragged past Nolan's dark, abandoned house, the heavy box began to violently vibrate and rattle. The men could feel the wood thumping against their shoulders, as if the entity inside was actively thrashing against the silk lining. Panicking under the shifting kinetic force, the men frantically tried to lay the casket down momentarily on the polished granite bench outside Nolan's porch to rest. The second the steel touched the stone, an unnatural, pressurized downward force slammed into the casket, causing it to tilt aggressively at a 45-degree angle, nearly crushing the pallbearer's legs against the concrete. The older brother had to step forward again, gripping the handles and shouting an apology into the rain, pleading for her spirit to calm down until the casket finally leveled out and allowed them to proceed to the cemetery. Once she was buried beneath the cold earth, a terrifying localized paranoia invaded our settlement. The first severe incident occurred at the local general store, located just a mile from the cemetery. The shopkeeper was an elderly, severely obese woman who was entirely confined to a heavy wheelchair behind the cash register. At exactly 5:30 p.m., just as the sun dipped below the ocean horizon, her family served her dinner at the counter before heading into the back warehouse to unpack freight. As she sat alone in the dim storefront, the bell above the door chimed. A woman walked in, wearing a drenched white winter coat, her long dark hair completely soaked and matted across her face. She kept her head tilted downward, walking with a stiff, rhythmic, lurching gait. She walked straight to the counter, her voice emerging as a raspy, familiar whisper that chilled the shopkeeper's bones. "Mrs. Clara, give me 5 packs of instant rations." She slid a crisp $100 bill across the wooden counter. Unable to reach the high shelves behind her, the shopkeeper yelled into the back room, "Sarah, come out here and grab 5 packs of noodles for the girl." From the warehouse, the daughter peered through the doorway. The front of the store was completely dark and empty. "Mom," she called out, a knot of unease tightening in her throat. "There's no one out there. Who are you talking to?" The shopkeeper snapped, turning back to the customer. "What do you mean? She's standing right." The shopkeeper froze. The drenched woman slowly lifted her head. "It was Julian's late wife." Thick, black, coagulated blood was streaming in steady rivers from her wide, unblinking eyes, her nose, and her mouth, completely soaking through the collar of her white coat. She smiled a wide, vacant, frozen smile. The elderly shopkeeper suffered an instantaneous panic attack, her chest seizing as she rolled out of her chair and collapsed violently onto the floorboards. When her daughter rushed out and revived her with smelling salts, the shopkeeper was completely incoherent, pointing her trembling fingers at the empty air. But the true horror was waiting on the counter. Clutched tightly in the shopkeeper's hand was the bill the woman had handed her. It wasn't a $100 note anymore. It had transformed into a charred, ancient sheet of local funeral ghost money, a piece of ritual parchment used in historic underworld offerings. Within days, multiple residents reported identical anomalies. Local delivery drivers hauling seafood shipments at 1 a.m. reported seeing a translucent female figure standing on the porch of Nolan's locked, abandoned house, rhythmically and silently sweeping the concrete with an old broom. Another courier driver pulled over near the property around midnight when he spotted a pregnant woman sitting alone on Nolan's granite bench. Thinking she was a stranded motorist, he rolled down his window and said, "Ma'am, my truck bed is entirely full of gear. I don't have room for a passenger. You should wait for the state trooper." The woman didn't reply. She slowly stood up, keeping her face cast in deep shadow, and began gently rubbing her swollen abdomen. She stepped backward, her body maintaining its rigid posture as she glided smoothly through the air, passing straight through the solid wooden siding of Nolan's locked house like a shadow slipping through a door. The driver slammed on the gas, completely urinating in his pants from pure, unadulterated terror. By November, our town was entirely paralyzed. Even at 12 p.m. noon, the streets were completely deserted. The local rumors of her aggressive midnight door rattling had driven the community into a catatonic state of isolation. Desperate to reclaim their lives, Julian's mother brought in an elder from a remote regional parish to execute a massive atmospheric cleansing over the marsh road, while the family constructed a massive, beautiful stone monument over her grave to seal her memory. Following the cleansing, the aggressive public anomalies finally ceased. The general store reopened, and the midnight sweeping stopped. But the entity hadn't left. It had simply retreated into Julian's domestic space. Julian eventually left the coastal settlement, moving his son to a mundane suburban development miles inland. He tried to rebuild his life, eventually marrying a gentle, quiet woman from the city to help him raise his boy. But a few weeks ago, Julian called me late at night, his voice trembling so hard I could barely recognize it. He told me that the night before, he had been lying in his new bedroom when a rhythmic, heavy tapping rattled his closet doors. He threw back the sheets, thinking his son had crawled out of bed, and pushed the door open. Standing inside the dark frame was his late wife, her skin pristine and white, holding a beautiful, radiant baby girl in her arms. She looked at Julian, her expression completely stern, and whispered a final chilling directive. "I see that she is kind to our son, so I will let you have your peace. But if she ever changes, if she ever harms him, I will return to this room and break her neck." Julian woke up in a cold sweat, but the physical scent of copper and fresh brine still lingers heavily in his modern suburban hallway. He told me he sleeps with the lights on now, completely paralyzed by the freezing realization that no matter how many miles he runs, the vault he opened on that fog-drenched coast will always know exactly where his children sleep.